Hashem. Today's daf is Masechta Menachos Daf 60, number 60, Daf Samach, and we're going to start from Omar Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef Omar Rav Yochanan. That's on 5 lines from the bottom of Nuntes Amid Beis. So we learned yesterday a discussion. That's our discussion of yesterday, where the Torah tells you by a minchas chayte, if you do certain averos like swearing falsely, and you can't afford to bring a regular carbon, right? If loy sasig yadoy l'shtei soirim, and you can't even afford birds, so then the Torah gives you an option for your kapara to bring a mincha. That's called a minchas chayte, and the Torah tells us don't put oil on it, lo yasim aleha shemen, v'lo yitein aleha levoina, and don't add any frankincense on it, because it's like a korban chatas. Hashem wants it very dry. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yochanan said, Nosan mashuhu shemen al gabei kazayis mincha pasal. If you put a drop of oil onto a kazayis of this mincha is like, say, flour, and you put a drop of oil on the tip of the mincha, like, it's in a pan full of flour, and you put a drop of oil in the edge there, pasal, it's disqualified. My time out. What's the reason? Because notice the pasuk says lo yosim. It doesn't say don't give oil there. Lo yosim, don't place. Sima koldu. Even a drop of oil will disqualify the mincha. Oleha means ad the ika shiura. You have to make sure that there's a shi'ir of kazayas, a bincha in one spot where you're putting the oil on. So therefore, that's the din by oil. Oil, a drop passes the mincha. But interestingly enough, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Rabbi Yochanan, nosan kazayas levoina. If you place in olives, like we saw how levoina looks, like a scoopful of these, granules, right? That's how levoina looks. It's sap that hardens into granules that comes from an aromatic tree. So if you put a kazayas levoina al gabe mashu mincha on a drop of the mincha, possible. So it's the opposite. Here, for the levoina to disqualify mincha, you have to put a kazayas of levoina, like a handful of levoina. My tama, because here the Torah says lo yitain levoina ksiv ad the ikinasina until you actually give something which is called a giving, and a giving means you have a shear. So that's interesting that the Chumash switches the word. Here it says lo yosim oleha. You can see in the screen here lo yosim oleha, and here it says lo yitain levoina. So levoina, in order to passel a minchas chayte, you have to have put a kazayas. Aleha means, we go to Samach Amar Aleph, have riba achariboy, ve riba achariboy alamai. You see, the aleha of shemen means that it has to be kazayas and mincha. And then the Torah repeats the aleha again by the levoina, so it's unnecessary. So for some reason, we have a drasha that by the levoina, we're going to say that even if it's a drop of the mincha, let's say it's separated out on a flat pan, and you have a drop of mincha, let's say like an ounce, and you pour a kazayas of levoin on top of them, the whole mincha is disqualified. The Ika the Amri, others say it wasn't so clear. Amar Rav Yosef, boy, Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan had a question. Nosan mashu shemen al gabe kazayis. If you put a little bit of oil on a kazayis mincha mahu, what would be the din? Mi amin ksima kinasina. Oiloi. Does the oil have to be like levoina? Just like levoina, it has to be a kazayis. So maybe by oil, you also have to put a kazayis of oil, not just a drop of oil. So the Ika the Amri, the other version was that Rabbi Yochanan wasn't sure, and Teku, he left it unresolved. Then we learned in the Mishnah, Nosan Shemen al Shiyoreha, right? The Chumash says, don't put oil on the mincha and don't put levoina on the mincha. But then the Chumash says that after you do the kamitza, then the rest is eaten by the kahanim, right? the rest of the mincha is eaten by the kahanim. This is a minchas choite. What happens if if someone puts oil on the leftover of the mincha? It doesn't disqualify the mincha. Tana Rabbanan, lo yasam olei al shaman v'liiten. So it says that it's Brisa says that it says don't put oil on this mincha, don't put frankincense. Yochel b'shnei kahanim. Maybe the Chumash is saying that the only times it's disqualified is only if one kohen is pouring the oil onto the mincha and one kohen is putting frankincense on the mincha. Talmud loima oleha begufo shemincha chasim medaba v'loy b'kohen. The Torah is only referring to the mincha itself, that the two lavin have to refer to the mincha itself. And as soon as you put shemen and levina, let's say you put shemen and levina on the mincha, then you get two malchus. And it doesn't matter how many kahanim did it. Even if you have one kohen putting shemen and levina onto this mincha, he gets two malchus. Yochol, I would have thought, says the Brisa. Lo yitin kli al gabe kli. Maybe the Chumash is saying that if you have a minchas chayte, you can't have another keli of oil resting on top of the mincha. Talmud loima oleha. That the oil that the Chumash was concerned about was that it gets mixed up into mincha. Only if it's mixed up into the mincha, that's what we're referring to. Now we begin the new Mishnah on Samach Amar Aleph. I want to call your attention that just remember, we've discussed this before. There's a concept called Hagosha. What is Hagosha? Hagosha is before you take the kamitza, and let's say you put the levina, there's a mitzvah of the kohen to walk over to the mizbeach and just touch it on the wall of the mizbeach. You see him doing that over here. So says the Mishnah, not all minchas needed that. Yesh tu'unis Hagosha. Some minchas need to touch the base of the mizbeach, ve'ein tu'unis tenufa, and it's not waved like a lulav. Hagosha u'tenufa. Some minchas need touching the mizbeach u'tenufa and waving it around. Tenufa, some need to be waved around. Loy Hagosha, not touching the mizbeach. And loy tenufa, loy Hagosha. Some minchas don't need any waving and not any touching. So now the Mishnah begins. Ve'elu tu'unas Hagosha, ve'ein tu'unas tenufa. The Mishnah is going to give you the list. The following minchas need to touch the mizbeach and don't need to be waved around. Minchas soiles, v'machvas, v'marcheshes, v'chalas, v'rakifikim. These types of mincha, all we need is, of course, they need a kamitza. All these types of minchas soiles and baked matzahs we saw, they need kamitzas. But before you do the kamitza, you need hagosha. You need to touch the mizbeach with it. Minchas kohanim. If a kohen brings a mincha, uminchas kohen mashiach, or the kohen gadol's mincha. Minchas goyim. If a goy brings a mincha, minchas noshim. If a woman donates a mincha, uminchas chayte, minchas that's brought as an avera. All these minchas have one thing in common, that it needs kamitza, and also we're making it in common that they all need hagosha. They need to touch the mizbeach. Says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, Rav Shimon argues. Rav Shimon says, minchos kahanim uminchas kohen mashiach ein behen hagosha. There's no din of hagosha touching the mizbeach by a minchas kohen mashiach. Remember, by a minchas kohen, if a kohen wants to donate a mincha, let's say he wants to donate a flour mincha, there is no kamitza. The Torah tells you, chol minchas kohen kolel tokter. That means you throw it, whole thing on the mizbeach, no kamitza. So it's a very different than if a Yisrael donates a mincha. So therefore, ein behem hagosha. According to Rabbi Shimon, they don't have the din of hagosha. Says the Mishnah, why? Lefi she'ein behem kamitza, because you don't do kamitza. Chol she'ein behem kamitza, since you're not doing a kamitza by the minchas kohen, nor the minchas of the kohen gadol, ein behem hagosha, there's no concept of bringing it close to the mizbeach. This Amar Papa, I don't know why it's here. We saw it yesterday. Amar Papa, kol hecha d'tnan. Anytime you make a donation, let's say of a minchas mafe taner, can you mix up 5 loaves of machvas and 5 loaves of machershes? No, esetanan. It has to be 10 of one kind. You can't mix and match. My Kamashmalan, what is Rav Papa trying to teach you? La Puke mid Rav Shimon, to exclude that we don't follow the viewpoint of Rav Shimon, the Amar who said, Mechza chalas or mechza rakikin yavi. If you want, you could bring half chalas and half rakikin, two different types of ways of baking and mixing oil. So Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion you could mix and match. Kamash Malandalai. Rav Papa disagrees, and the halacha is that you could only have one kind. If you make a donation, it has to be 10 of the same. Now, the Gemara wants to bring a pasuk of where does it say Hagasha in the Torah? So let's take a look at the Chumash over here. It's on your screen. The Minchas Marcheshes. Here, the Torah tells you by Marcheshes. Remember, Marcheshes is a deep pan, karbanecha. So it's soilus b'shem, make it with oil and flour. The hadesa is a minchas yasa me'elel Hashem. Bring it to that you're going to make to Hashem. The kohen brings it close. The gisha el hamizbeach. You see, the gisha el hamizbeach. The gisha el hamizbeach. So you bring it close means you're supposed to touch the mizbeach. So that's that concept that we're talking about. So how do you know it applies by everything? So the Gemara is going to explain. How do you know there's a concept of Hagasha? Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. Ilu Nemar, if it would just say that they saw Ashiya Asam El Hashem, V'hikriv El HaKoyen, V'higisha. If the Chumash would just say, that they saw as a mincha Ashiya El Hashem, any of these minchas you should bring, and V'higisha El HaMizbeach, right? V'kriva El HaKoyen V'grisha El HaMizbeach. It doesn't say the kriva el hakayim, the gisha el mizbeach, right? I would have thought, just reading the pasuk, only types of minchas are, if you just have this pasuk, I only learned from the Chumash that only types of minchas that are very similar to mincha marcheshes, which are any of the 5 types of minchas in the beginning of Parshas Vayikra, where those minchas are required to take a kamitza. How do I know mincha menayim? How do I know? I would think that only the kaimitz has to be brought close to the mizbeach. Maybe the Chumash means to say that instead of bringing the whole mincha to the mizbeach, maybe just the kaimitz, you just touch the mizbeach. That little scoop, go to the mizbeach and touch it on the mizbeach. How do you know it's the entire mincha that needs to be touched on the mizbeach? On that, the pasuk says ve'veses a mincha right over here. Mincha, the entire mincha is touched on the mizbeach. So that you know clearly. Mincha menayin tamila mincha. Minchas choyte menayin. How do you know a minchas choyte? Minchas choyte. It doesn't say in the Chumash that it needs Hagasha, and it's not in the beginning of Vayikra. It's towards the end of the Parsha of Vayikra. How do you know the sinner's mincha also needs to be touched by the Mizbeach? Talmud loime es ha mincha. Es means to include a mincha's chayte also needs to be touched. Now the Gemara is just going to ask a simple question. I don't need a pasuk to tell me. That the mincha, that the mincha's chayte needs hagasha. I could figure it out on my own. V'dinu, isn't it a kal v'chayma? Nema, not even a kal v'chayma, binyan av. Nema hacha, it says over here, we go to Amid Beis, minchas chayva. V'nema hacha b'minchas nedava. It says that a minchas chayte is an obligation. And it says, the Torah also talks about a minchas nedava, a voluntary mincha. And so we'll say, ma minchas nedava tu'una hagasha, just like the voluntary mincha needs hagasha, af minchas chayven tu'una hagasha. I'll say the mincha that you're obligated to bring also needs hagasha to touch the mizbeach. So it's a very simple. I don't need a pasuk to teach me. So the Gemara says you wouldn't be able to learn minchas chayte from a minchas nedava. Mala minchas nedava shekein tu'una shemen levina. The minchas nedava is more stricter because it needs oil and levina. So maybe there's another requirement to touch the mizbeach. But a minchas chayte, since it doesn't need shem and levina, maybe I would say, without the pasuk, that the Torah does not require you to touch the mizbeach. So then the Gemara says, okay, minchas saita techia, but included in that is minchas saita. A minchas saita is a type of mincha of by a saita where we just said that it's required to, the Esha mincha tells us that the mincha includes a minchas saita. So a minchas saita, we're going to find that the Torah tells you, that it needs hagasha, because we're going to have a pasuk later on that says v'yikriva that even a minchas saita needs hakrafa to touch the mizbeach. So you have two cases, two situations. Oh, not yet. Ma'ala minchas saita shekain tuna tenufa. But you can't learn a minchas choite from a minchas saita because minchas saita has much stricter requirements. It needs tenufa. So then minchas nedava. So we go back to minchas nedava. And you're going to ask that minchas choite is not like a minchas nedava, and it's not like a minchas saita, but there's a common denominator between the two. The chazar din, and you go back and forth. But you look for the common denominator. Loy rozek rozek, loy rozek rozek. The chumrah of minchas saita is not the same chumrah as minchas nedava, and minchas nedava is not like minchas saita. Hatzad hashava shebehem, the common denominator between the minchas saita and the mincha nadav, the minchas nadava is shavu l'kmitza. They both need kmitza with shavu l'hagasha, and they both need hagasha. Afani avi minchas choite sheshavu lehem kmitza tishva lehem lahagasha. That it should be similar to minchas choite should be similar to them, and since it also requires kmitza, it should also require hagasha. So the whole kasha that the Gemara is asking is, what do I need this pasuk? Es hamincha, you see the es hamincha, the es hamincha to teach you what? A minchas choite means hagasha. Even without that, I would be able to learn that a minchas choite needs hagasha from minchas nedava and from minchas saita. So simple, I don't need the es hamincha. The answer is you wouldn't be able to learn that because mal etzad shavash behem. A rich person and a poor person could bring the same minchas saita and the same minchas nadava. Even if a rich person says, I want to bring a mincha, sure enough, he could bring it. But a minchas chaita is different. It's not, this minchas chaita cannot be brought by an asher like a poor person. Only a poor person can bring a minchas chaita. So therefore, I really have no source that a minchas chaita needs hagasha. Talmud loima esa mincha. Therefore, esa mincha is minchas chaita. So we know from the chumash that minchas nedava, if you donate a mincha, you make hagasha, and we know esa mincha to teach you that a minchas chaita also needs hagasha. Now, the Gemara is just going to bring the source that we touched on before, as how do you know that a minchas chaita needs hagasha? So the Torah says, "V'hevesa l'rabbis es hagasha, v'chein hu oimer v'avesim es reishis kitzirchem el hakoyim, v'hikriva l'rabbis minchas chaita lahagasha." What does the pasuk say? V'hikriva. Let's put it in English. Let's put it over here in a different color. V'hikriva, and then the Chumash says v'hevesa in green. It's two extra words. V'hevesa is a mincha. So we darshan, the Havesa teaches you that a minchas oimer also needs hagasha, and the hikriva teaches you a minchas saita needs hagasha, because by a minchas saita it uses the same word, v'chikriv oisei elam esbeah. So from those two extra words, a marba minchas saita and a marba a minchas ha'oimer. Now, why do I need, the Gemara is now going to say, b'dinhu, why do I need psukim to be marba a minchas saita? The Gemara is going to, or minchas oimer. The dinu ma minchas chayte she'ena tunu tnifa tuna hagasha. Minchas chayte does not have to be waived. It doesn't need trufa, but it needs hagasha. Minchas chayte she'tuna tnufa eina din she'tuna hagasha. Minchas chayte is more stricter. It needs tnufa. Certainly, it should need hagasha. So, in other words, why do I need the hikriva? I could learn it out by myself. And then you're going to ask, Mala minchas chayta shekem bo chitin. A minchas chayta as more stricter than a minchas soita. A minchas soita comes out of wheat. It comes from wheat. A minchas soita, it doesn't come from wheat. It comes from I think it comes from barley. So then minchas oimer techia. So minchas oimer also comes from barley flour. Then and it needs hagasha. Mala minchas oimer came to Neshem Elavina. But minchas oimer is not like a minchas soita because it needs oil and frankincense. Minchas chayta techia. Then you go back to minchas chayta. Because adin loy rozeh kroyzeh, loy rozeh kroyzeh. The bottom line between a minchas ha'omer and a minchas ha'omer and a minchas chayte is sheshavu l'kamitza, that they both have kamitza, v'shava la'gasha, and they both have a gasha. So I'm going to bring a minchas soita tishvu lahem la'gasha, that it should be for hagasha. Again, Gemara's question is, what do I need this? We just told you that this vihikriva in green over here teaches you that also a minchas soita needs hagasha, right? It needs vihigisha. Why do I need this vihikriva, the extra word vihikriva? Why can't I learn it on my own? That it should be from like a kal v'chaymer, from a minchas chayte and a minchas oimer. If minchas chayte needs hagasha, minchas oimer needs hagasha, so we see that anything that needs kamitza should get hagasha. What do I need this with pasuk veikriva? Answers the Gemara, Ma'alat Sadav Sada Shavash Bam Shekain Lehuchshur Love Kema. Time of Minchas Soita Shehuchshur Love Kema. Tamad Loima Veikriva. Minchas Soita is different than any other mincha, where it doesn't have to be fine flour. It could be kemach. Whereas the minchas ha'omer, even though it's being used as barley flour, it has to be like soil, very finely sifted flour. And also regular minchas choite is also made out of wheat flour, which is soilless. So therefore, I cannot learn a minchas soita from a minchas choite and minchas omer. That's why the Torah had to write vihikriva. One more piece. Rabbi Yehuda says a little bit different. Till now, what did Rav Shimon say? That vehevesa, Ravesa teaches you a minchas omer, and the hikriva teaches you a minchas soita. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, no, the hevesa just teaches you minchas soita, lahagasha, right? And the hikriva, he probably will find another thing for the hikriva. The chein baby is a mincha carbon allow. So minchas soita is marba from the hevesa, not like Rabbi Shimon said, it's minchas oimer from the hevesa. Yehuda says the hevesa teaches you minchas soita, but comes along Rabbi Yehuda and says, "Ava minchas oimer lo tzricha kra." I don't need a pasuk for minchas oimer at all. My tama, what's the reason? Medina kasa, I can figure it out on my own. Ma minchas chayta sheina tuna trufa tuna hagasha. Minchas chayta doesn't have to be waved around. Needs hagasha. Minchas oimer, the minchas oimer shetuna tenufa was waved around. Ein adin shetuna hagasha. Of course, it shouldn't be need touch. Oh, mala minchas chayta shekei ba chitem. A minchas chayta is made out of wheat. That's why it needs hagasha. So I'll say minchas chayta techia. A minchas soita is made out of barley, like the minchas oimer, and it also needs to hagasha. Oh, you can ask a question. Mala minchas soita shekaim bar lavara oven, the mascara's oven. Who the whole point of minchas soita is to bring about a kapara, reminds God of an avera. So therefore, maybe minchas soita requires hagasha and not minchas oimer. Minchas chayta techia. It's not coming to minchas chayta is bringing about a kapara, as opposed to minchas soita, which is trying to see if you did an avera in the first place. The bottom line is, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you can figure out minchas oimer on your own. That it's similar to those requiring kamitza. That's why it needs a karasha. Well, my parach. So what's Rabbi Shimon have a problem with that? But minchas oimer could be learned from a minchas oimer could be learned from a minchas chayte and a minchas soita. So what's the problem with that? So Reb Shimon says, Malat Sad Shavish Bahem Shekem Mitzuyin. Minchas soita and a minchas chayte can happen all year round. If somebody does an avera, you can have 10 soitas a year, or 10, or 30 minchas chaytes during the year. But a minchas oimer comes once a year. So maybe it doesn't require. That's why Rab Shimon needs another pasuk to teach you that Minchas Oimer requires Hagasha. Rabbi Yehuda, what does Rabbi Yehuda says? Ada Rava, hot mitzuyat. Just the opposite. Minchas Oimer happens more often. Hamnach zimnum deloy mishkachta lo klal. It's possible not to have a minchas soita at all. Maybe there was no soita that year, and it's also possible not to have a minchas chayta. Maybe nobody did an avera that year, or nobody's poor. So therefore, it's also not so common. So that's why Rabbi Yehuda maintains his kal v'chomer or his tzad shava, and Rabbi Shimon had a problem with him. That's why he needs an extra pasuk. Concludes the Gemara. Maybe v'havesa, you're telling me that the Chumash saying v'havesa is teaching you either it's including minchas soita or minchas oimer. Maybe v'havesa is teaching you something altogether different, and that is that a yochid can make a donation of instead of a minchas chitin, he can make a minchas sa'orin. You know, the Chumash gives you an idea. If you want to make a donation, you can only use wheat. Maybe the Chumash is telling you the hevesa, you can bring any type of mincha you want. You want to use spelt, use spelt. If you want to use flour, you want to use barley. V'dinu, and I'll make a kal v'chayma. Tzivi maybe minachitin chayva, maybe mincha sayin chayva. A tzibor brings from a mincha from wheat, and it also brings from barley. A mincha sayimer is barley. Af yachid, it's also an individual. Shemevi minachit in the dava, that he could bring a donation of a wheat mincha. Yavi mincha min asayrim in the dava. I would think he could bring a mincha from sa'irim. Talmud loima ela. Only these, he could only, if you're making a donation, you could only bring a wheat flour mincha. Elu ela ela. You could only bring these. Oy eino oime ela elo oime harei alai mincha. Shemevi chamishtam. That means maybe Eila is teaching you that only if you say Harei Alai Mincha, you bring any one of these five. But how do you know it's only these five? Talmud Loima me Eila. Rotza Achas maybe, Rotza Chamishta maybe. It means you could bring one of them, or you could bring all five. I mean, that's up to you. But the bottom line is, I don't need Vavesa to teach me that you cannot bring a barley mincha, because I know that from Eila, where the Torah says only bring these types of mincha. So then the Hevesa will teach you something else. That what? That a minchas oimer or a minchas soita needs to also hagasha. So we learned today about hagasha, that many minchas soita, minchas choite, minchas nedava, all need this thing of touching the mizbeach. Okay, we'll stop over here.
Thank you.